The 5th of January, 1942. Tokyo was drunk on victory. Exultant shouts echoed through the streets. A nation celebrating an empire that seemed to expand effortlessly with every passing day. But far from the cheering crowds, aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto did not share their joy. He instructed his staff to begin preparing for the second stage of operations. But his mood was dark. The reports confirmed that the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies would soon be entirely under Japanese control. The speed of the conquest astounded even the planners in Tokyo. Yet Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, to have new plans ready by mid-February. While the ardent militarists in Tokyo wanted to press on indefinitely, drunk on their own success, Yamamoto was a man at sea in more ways than one. He had opposed this war with the United States and Britain. He knew their industrial might. He remained at sea partly because his friends on the Imperial General Staff feared assassination by patriotic extremists if he stayed in Tokyo. His warnings were stark. He had told an ultranationalist friend months before Pearl Harbor that Japan would start by stretching out like an octopus, tentacles spreading everywhere. Now, just a month in, the octopus was already spread flat. He knew the euphoria was a dangerous illusion. He believed that once Singapore fell, perhaps in 5 or 6 months, Britain might be unsettled enough to negotiate. He needed a quick, spectacular victory to force the West to the table within a year and a half. After that, he knew Japan's window would close. But the victory at Pearl Harbor had been incomplete. The American battleships were gone, but the aircraft carriers, the true arbiters of this new naval war, had been at sea. They remained a lethal threat. Yamamoto needed to draw them out and destroy them. The army vetoed his idea of attacking the Soviet Union. They were too bogged down in China. They refused a Middle Eastern link-up with Germany. That left 2 options: isolate Australia by taking the islands to its north and east, or Yamamoto's preferred plan, a decisive thrust at Midway Island to draw out the American fleet, coupled with an invasion of the Aleutians. The debate in Tokyo was fierce. The Naval General Staff wanted Australia. Yamamoto wanted Midway. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but in April, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers raided Tokyo. The physical damage was slight, but the psychological shock was immense. The Americans had touched the sacred soil of Japan. The debate ended instantly. Yamamoto got his Midway operation. They moved with supreme confidence. In May, they tried to take Port Moresby by sea, but were turned back at the Coral Sea, a tactical setback they barely acknowledged. They believed the Americans were soft, demoralized, and incapable of a fierce fight. They did not know that their own codes were being broken, that their movements were being watched. In Washington, Admiral Ernest J. King knew time was running out. The Japanese were moving into the Solomons, building an airfield on a humid, obscure island called Guadalcanal. If they completed it, their bombers could threaten the supply lines to Australia. King demanded an immediate offensive. General Douglas MacArthur wanted a massive thrust with carriers and divisions he didn't have. King, a man of icy determination, devised his own plan, a Navy-led drive starting from the New Hebrides. It would be a shoestring operation, hastily assembled, commanded by Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, a man already consumed by gloom over the lack of resources. The timetable was brutal. 17,000 Marines were moving by troopship from California and Pearl Harbor. Intelligence was wretched. They didn't even know exactly where the Japanese airfield was until practically the eve of landing. The rehearsal in Fiji was a disaster, with only a third of the troops even getting ashore. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier force that would protect the landings, was already gun-shy from his losses at Coral Sea and Midway. At a tense meeting on July 28, he announced he would only keep his carriers in support for 2 days. He would not risk his precious flat tops for longer. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, was furious, but Fletcher outranked him. The Marines would be landing with an expiration date on their air cover. Fortune, however, favored the bold approach. As the 75 American ships moved toward the Solomons in early August, the skies were overcast, blinding Japanese search planes. The Japanese at Rabaul were focused entirely on New Guinea, convinced the Americans were battered and defensive. They had no inkling that an invasion fleet was steaming right into their southern perimeter. On the morning of August 7, the sky cleared. The American fleet slipped past Savo Island into the calm waters between Guadalcanal and Florida Island. At 6 a.m., the carrier planes struck. They caught the Japanese completely by surprise. At the seaplane base on Gavutu, 7 large flying boats and 9 float planes were destroyed at their moorings before they could even start their engines. A frantic radio message went out from Tulagi. Enemy heavy bombardment in progress. It was the last clear word many Japanese commanders would hear for days. On Guadalcanal itself, the landings were surreal. The Marines hit the beaches, braced for slaughter, and found nothing. The main Japanese force there was largely construction troops, laborers who fled into the jungle at the first salvo. Marines advanced cautiously, finding camps with breakfast still on the tables, bowls of rice half-eaten, chopsticks dropped in haste. It was too easy, and the veterans felt an uneasy itch. They wanted a fight they could see, just 20 miles away, across the channel on Tulagi and the tiny islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo. The fight they wanted was raging with medieval ferocity. Here, the garrison was not laborers, but elite troops of the Yokohama Air Group. They dug into the coral caves and hillsides, creating interlocking fields of fire that defied naval bombardment. Colonel Merritt Edson's Marine Raiders, tough volunteers trained in gung-ho tactics, had to chop their way through steaming jungle just to reach the ridgelines. They learned quickly that the Japanese would not surrender. In one dugout, 3 cornered officers used their last bullets to kill each other rather than be taken. On Tanambogo, Japanese sailors swarmed over stalled Marine tanks, jamming crowbars into the treads and setting them alight with gasoline-soaked rags. It was a brutal, close-quarters extermination. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss, wounded by his own grenade, thrown back at him, grabbed a submachine gun and stormed a cave alone, killing 4 enemies before collapsing. It took days to clear the tiny islands. There were 500 Japanese on Gavutu and Tanambogo when the fighting started. When it ended, there were none. The real threat, however, was forming in the air and on the sea to the north. At Rabaul, the alarm triggered an immediate response. 27 Betty bombers, already loaded for a strike on New Guinea, were redirected to Guadalcanal. They were escorted by 18 of Japan's finest Zero pilots, including the legendary Saburo Sakai. It was an 1,100-mile round trip, a grueling test of endurance. They arrived over the invasion fleet at noon on August 8. The warnings from Australian coast watchers had given the American carriers time to prepare. The Wildcat fighters, slower and less maneuverable than the nimble Zeros, found they could take tremendous punishment. They tore into the unescorted bombers. Sakai, confused by American tactics, jumped what he thought were fighters, only to find himself flying straight into the rear guns of American SBD dive bombers. His Zero was shattered, his skull creased by a bullet, yet he managed to limp his crippled plane all the way back to Rabaul, a testament to supreme pilot skill fighting a losing war of attrition. But attrition was working both ways. Admiral Fletcher, nervous about his fighter losses, 21 planes in 2 days, made his fateful decision. He withdrew the carriers on the evening of August 8, earlier than he had even threatened. He left Admiral Turner's transports naked, still unloading critical supplies on the beaches. And into this vacuum steamed Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. From Rabaul, he had assembled a task force of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. He raced down the slot, the long channel running through the Solomon Islands. American intelligence had failed spectacularly. A request for a special air search of the slot had been lost in the shuffle of commands. Mikawa's ships, undiscovered, lethal, and masters of night combat, were closing in on the unsuspecting Allied fleet near Savo Island. The easy landing was over. The real battle for Guadalcanal was just beginning, in the dark, undefended waters.